Hello, welcome to the show. My name's Charles Parselle. I'm really excited today to have with me one of the more interesting and eminent attorneys in a particular field in Los Angeles law, attorney Fran Campbell. Fran, good morning. How nice to see you.
Good morning. Nice to see you too.
Now, I know you're in a very interesting area of the law, one particularly pertinent today, in today's climate and economic situation. But let's start at the beginning and talk about how you got into the law in the first place. Are you one of those who went to law school, got a job in a firm and started, at a young age practicing law?
Well, except for the going to law school part, which I did do, none of that is true. I kind of fell into being a lawyer. I started my college career at the age of 32 when I got tired of playing in a band and being a taxi driver. So at that point I thought perhaps I should get a career. And so I decided to go back to school. I went to Santa Monica College to get an AA degree, transferred to UCLA, transferred to USC Law School. And that's that story. That's an interesting story. In that, well, it's interesting in itself, but you were, during the whole first part of your, during your 20s really, you played in a band, and what did you play? I played bass guitar, and to make money I was a taxi driver in Boston. And I did that for about a decade, and at some point I got tired of having to make decisions about my career and my life with 3 other people who were my bandmates. So I thought that I really needed to get a job. And so that's when I decided to go back to school, although I had no idea what I would do. And so, but finally you ended up as a lawyer. So as your undergrad degree, what did you do? Well, yeah, at UCLA I got my degree in study of religion, not because I was religious at all, but because it just seemed like the most interesting thing to study. And I had the most interesting classes. I could take classes in Hungarian folklore and Buddhist sutra, and so it was an interesting way to spend my time. The goal was to get a degree. It didn't really matter what subject, so that was the subject I thought was interesting at the time. And that led you inexorably, it seems like quite a big jump actually to me, from religious studies into the law. Yeah, that's what everyone says, but it's really not. Because in both the law and in religion, you're studying a system of belief and a system that's supposed to guide a society. So where you have religious laws, it's not that far of a step to go to secular laws. But I didn't go into religion with the idea that I will be a lawyer or study laws at all. I completely fell into that. At the time, I was working part-time so I could pay my tuition as a legal secretary at a bankruptcy firm. And while I was at the bankruptcy firm, if someone had asked me, don't you think you want to be a lawyer and practice law, I would have shuddered. I would have said absolutely not. There could be nothing more boring than this. So I really did not plan to go into law school. But you did, and you became a lawyer. Yes, I did. I couldn't think of what else to do. And so here you are, practicing law in Los Angeles, the huge city of Los Angeles. Now, that's an interesting story. When you got into the law, then you were you already had at least 2 lives. The life of a taxi driver, which is extraordinary, and the life of a musician in a band, also most unusual. And now you join the legal profession. The legal profession, as we know, is pretty extensive, and there's really an endless number of legal specialties. Did you end up in a legal specialty? I did end up in a legal specialty, but it was pure chance, as almost everything in my life is and was. I started off working in a class action firm, And then I decided I needed to go get some experience actually being a lawyer instead of just doing research and writing briefs, which is what you do as a very junior lawyer in a firm that does multi-million-dollar, billion-dollar litigation. So I went to a small firm where they practice criminal and civil litigation and got my experience doing mostly civil litigation from the beginning of drafting the complaint through trial. Then I was lucky enough to have an opportunity to start my own firm in 2005. And I got into tenants' rights. And it's very funny how that happened. I believe I was literally driving away from my last day at the firm when I got a call from someone who I had worked with previously, who asked me if I wanted to take a case involving a landlord-tenant situation where the landlord wasn't taking care of the building and a lot of tenants had complaints. Now, how that happened is that someone I had met with years earlier who knew I had an interest in a particular case that she was working on referred someone else to me. So I started a relationship with the Eviction Defense Network, and I started doing defending evictions, and they kept referring cases to me involving landlord-tenant situations where the tenants are suing the landlord and not vice versa. It was complete chance that I got into this, but because they kept giving me cases and giving me opportunities to work on their cases, I developed a specialty in tenants' rights.
So now you're a tenants' rights attorney.
Yes, I am.
And so I can understand getting a case and working on it and getting more cases. But I would think that there may be something in that particular field of law that you find quite attractive and fulfilling.
Well, there is. Tenants have a lot of rights, but at least in Los Angeles, where we have rent control, and the same as in Santa Monica and West Hollywood, Beverly Hills, but mostly tenants don't know what their rights are. Mostly tenants don't know what the laws are that govern their situation with their landlords. So what's attractive about tenants' rights is many times the cases involve a landlord who is just acting in a terrible fashion, either not making repairs or lying to the tenants about one thing or the other, trying to evict them on fraudulent grounds. And what's attractive about it is that the landlord never sees it coming. The landlord assumes very often that the tenant is a person who's, well, they're in a weak financial position, and the landlord assumes that they don't have any resources to fight them or even find out what the landlord is doing wrong. So it's very satisfying when you have a landlord who's being very abusive to his tenants to file a lawsuit against that landlord. It's a good feeling.
Can you give us an example of such a case?
Sure. I have a case right now where the landlord was ordered to evict some tenants. And this is in Los Angeles, where you have rent control. The reason why the landlord was ordered to evict the tenants is the landlord had an illegal triplex in the back of her lot, where it was supposed to be a single-family house in front and a duplex in the back, but it had been turned into a triplex.
So a triplex is 3 units.
3 side
attached.
by side. And
Right.
they just put in some fake walls and put in some plumbing and utilities and called it an extra unit, label the doors A, B, and C. Well, what happens is sometimes the building and safety department will find out about these little programs or projects that the landlord has, and will come in and investigate and say, well, landlord, we caught you. You have to turn your triplex back into a duplex. Well, when the landlord has to do that, then obviously someone has to go. So this particular landlord, who had also been having arguments with the tenants over utilities, decided that she would evict them, but do it in an illegal way. Under the Los Angeles law, when the Building and Safety Department comes in and says, well, you have to evict your tenants, they're in an illegal place, then you have to pay them relocation. And the relocation can be very expensive. In the case of someone with children, right now it's $17,600.
Wow.
So you can imagine there's a lot of resistance to paying the tenants that kind of money to move out. What this particular landlord did was tell the tenants that she was going to evict, I'm going to fumigate the residents. So she covered the entire thing with a tent, gave each tenant $100 to go to a motel. And then once it was covered and the tenants left, just demolished the inside of the 2 units. Took out all the plumbing, all the utilities, all the kitchens, and took the tenants' belongings and either drove them away in a truck or threw them in the trash. And the tenants came back to nothing. It's extraordinary.
It is. And the land, say, you take on that type of case, or that particular case in this instance, and what are you doing? What do you do? What's the remedy for the tenant?
Well, the remedy for the tenant is money. One of the most important things to almost anyone is that they have their home. We all live our lives expecting that when we go home at the end of the day, we'll have a place to go and a familiar couch to sit on and the people we love there. You know, we can have dinner, and we have these expectations. So when something that basic is taken away from you, it's quite a shock. Not to mention, in this case, the tenants had lost all their belongings. So they had the clothes on their back. And they had children they had to feed and clothe, and they had to distribute them among relatives. So what's the remedy? The remedy isn't they can go back into the place, because they can't now that it's demolished. The only remedy is to get enough money to compensate them for what the landlord did, and then hopefully we will try to get punitive damages against the landlord to make an example out of them so they don't do this to tenants in the future.
Interesting. Now, you mentioned that tenants have lots of rights, but they don't really know what they are. So perhaps in a couple of minutes, you could just give a short brief on what kind of rights do tenants have, and also what kind of rights do landlords have, because they count in the equation as well.
Well, landlords, they have the right to collect rent. It's a business, and the business has regulations. The landlord has to take care of his rental units. That's the law. He has to, in the words of the law, repair all dilapidations. So they have to make sure there's very basic things: hot and cold running water, kitchen facilities. They have to make sure that the rental unit's not overrun with rodents or cockroaches. They have to make sure that the floors are in good condition and there are not holes in the walls. Very basic things. Now, tenants know this, I think, instinctively, but when the landlord does something like come into their unit and decide to repipe it and leave lots of holes in the walls, they don't really know what to do in that situation. And at least in the case of Los Angeles, what they can do is call the Los Angeles Housing Department. And the Los Angeles Housing Department will immediately send out an investigator or a code enforcement officer who can issue an order that the landlord makes certain repairs. That's one thing that most tenants, I feel, do not know and should know, that very often your city is going to have some kind of enforcement mechanism to force landlords to keep their rental units in good condition. It could be the Building and Safety Department, it could be the Housing Department, or it could be called neighborhood services. But most cities do have some kind of government mechanism to enforce tenants' rights. And very often, if they get a lawyer involved, either it's too expensive to hire someone to make the tenant fix a window, or it would take too long. So tenants really need to take advantage of what the government offers in that regard.
And if they don't, well, if they use the government then, in that, so essentially call local authorities in the city, Los Angeles, Santa Monica, wherever it might be, then does that mean a private attorney like you is less likely to get involved?
Well, yes, and I hope I don't have to get involved. If a tenant calls me and they have no running water, that's a serious health concern. They need to call the health department right away, and they need to get the water on. If they hire me, all I can do is sue to get the water on, and that just takes a very long time. That's not going to help the tenant immediately. So what I would like tenants to do is to take the step of calling whatever government agency they have available to them so they can get their immediate health and safety needs taken care of.
Right. So you are, in a sense, then a backup when even the government intervention doesn't help.
Well, there's some things that government intervention can't help. I had a case where the manager of the building came down to my client's apartment where they were having a family gathering, some kind of birthday party, I think, and the radio was too loud for his liking, and instead of just saying, "Can you turn your radio down," decided it would be more effective to pistol whip the tenant and send him to the hospital in a coma. That's the kind of thing you need to hire an attorney for, to sue for damages so that the tenant can recover their medical bills and money to compensate them for being injured in that way. But those are the kind of things the government can't fix immediately.
That you're essential for that kind of service. Now, I'm married to someone who's a landlady, and the idea of no hot and cold, holes in the wall, cockroaches on the floor, would horrify her as much as it horrifies us. So I'm wondering then, I'm assuming then that we're looking at really a minority of landlords in the city.
I would assume that too. My own landlord is wonderful.
Right.
He fixes everything right away. He's a very pleasant person. There's no friction between us at all. I don't know if he knows what I do for a living, but that's another point. I think most landlords want to take care of their property. However, where you have a rent-controlled jurisdiction, there's an extreme profit motive to not take care of your building, and there's an extreme profit motive to illegally evict people. Let me give you an example. I had a case where a young real estate agent invested in, once again, it was a house with a triplex. Mm-hmm. And he purchased it for less than $500,000. This is 4 units now in the city of Los Angeles. Mm. And the reason why it was a very good price was, one, it was in very bad condition and needed a lot of things fixed. And two, it had long-term tenants in it who were rent-controlled and were paying far below market. One was paying in the 600 range for a house. The other one was paying 700 and something for a 2-bedroom apartment. And this is in a nice area of town, Silver Lake. So he purchased the property. And the thing he wanted to do was evict them. He wanted to evict the tenants. But he couldn't, because in Los Angeles you have to have good cause to evict. So he made up a story. There is a way you can evict tenants. There are a couple ways. One is if you say my family member is moving into your unit, like my mother or my daughter is going to move in. So he said to the tenants, well, my father is going to move into your unit, and my mother is going to move into your unit. Well, that's very hard to fight. He says it's so, it must be so. And so my 2 clients in these 2 different units moved out. Then one was driving by the property and saw a for sale sign. Well, it turns out he evicted everyone and then turned around and sold the place for over $1 million, which he had just purchased a year and a half earlier for less than $500,000. And so there's a big motivation there for landlords to buy these places that are cheap because of the tenants paying very low rent, and evict them so they can flip it and get the true market value for the property.
So in the situation you've just described, then, that's not the kind of problem that the city authorities can get involved in, is it? Is that something just for you as a private attorney?
The city gets involved part way. When a landlord wants to evict someone from his apartment because a family member is moving in, he has to fill out a declaration and file it with the housing department. The housing department keeps track of how many times the landlord has done this. So there's a little bit of oversight, but very little. They won't actually prevent him from moving in his relatives, and they won't question his motivations. They won't really question whether or not he's going to. There's very little that the city can do about that. So that's the kind of thing that you need a private attorney for if one is a tenant who's paying below market rent and feels they've been evicted fraudulently.
That you'd call that fraudulent eviction. He said, I want to move my mum and dad in, but in fact he wanted to put it on the market and sell it. So what's the remedy then for the tenant if they are fortunate, if they find out that that's going on? Because as you said, the tenant just happened to be driving by and saw the for sale sign.
Well, it's interesting actually, because what people don't think about is that their leasehold interest has a value above what they are paying. For instance, if I'm paying $500 a month for a one-bedroom apartment, but I know that the landlord has rented the next door apartment that's the same as mine for $1,500, I have something of great value there that the law has bestowed on me. Because of my long-term residence, I have an apartment that's worth $1,500 a month, and I only have to pay $500. So when the landlord evicts someone fraudulently in that situation, they're not taking away a $500 a month apartment. What the landlord's taking away is a $1,500 a month interest in that apartment. In a way, he's stealing $1,000 a month from that person, because we all know very well they can't go out and get another $500 apartment. They don't exist. The tenant's going to have to pay $1,500. And so I hope to be able to recover what was taken from the tenant, and that is that $1,000 a month. And then there's ways that you can figure out the value of that. There are studies, and economists can testify. There are studies that if you are elderly, for instance, you are less likely to move than if you are 22. That's something we know instinctively because we've all been 22 and we moved around a lot. If you have kids that you raised in that house, you're less likely to move. So there's a way to figure out how long the person would have been there but for the fraud of the landlord. So really, there is a monetary value to your rent-controlled tenancy. It's great. It's a boon, really, from the government to you, that you get this, particular benefit of having a $1,500 a month apartment for $500.
Which I think, yes, rightly said, a boon from the government as a matter of social policy. So now I want to look at it from the landlord's point of view, just briefly. So the landlord has an obligation. We don't have too much time for this. The landlord has an obligation to maintain the property in a habitable condition.
Yes.
So I imagine some landlords get themselves in a position where the rents are insufficient to cover their expenses, especially if they've got a decent-sized mortgage, but the law is imposing on them an obligation to spend money, or if there's a relocation involved, to pay, as you say, quite a substantial amount of relocation. This could squeeze a landlord who's not in a very sound financial position himself or herself.
Well, that sounds correct, but I'm going to disagree with you. And the reason is the city council decided that rents needed to be maintained at a certain level for people who are long-term residents. And the fact that there are below-market tenants in your building makes the value of the building you are buying less. So you're not paying full market value as if it were a decontrolled building. You're paying a lower amount, like my example of the landlord who paid less than $500,000 for a 4-unit place. The reason he could do that is because the tenants were paying so little. So the government has made it so the landlord will always get a fair return on their investment. And what they can gain from the property is reflected in the purchase price. They pay less. So really, a landlord should not, I don't think landlords are being particularly squeezed. I think that they want to, you know, of course they always want to make more money. Everyone does. I do in my own business. But they have to do it in a legal way. And if they follow the law, they can make back their investment plus make a living. It's only the landlords who want to circumvent the system who are making the really high amounts of money. So I think the market takes care of the landlords in terms of maintenance. And if the landlord needs to put a new roof on, there's a mechanism where he can go to the government and pass that cost on to his tenants too.
I see. So then the law is rather carefully worked out in this sense, that the purchase price of these buildings is always the purchase price reflects the economic realities of the return on the building, and whoever buys is capable, and all that information is available to him or her. Interesting. So this is the way you now choose, after all your years as a musician, which is an extraordinary occupation in itself, and all those interesting things that you've done. I especially like driving a taxi. But now you really pass your days defending or, you know, pursuing the rights of tenants who come to you. You must enjoy it.
Well, it's very satisfying.
Yeah.
When you win. You don't always win. It's one thing. Litigation is very risky and dangerous.
So when you lose, you, the attorney, are going to pay the price. All right. Listen, this has been great. Enjoyed it very much. I want to thank you so much for coming on the show, and I hope we have an opportunity to do it again sometime.
Thank you.
So I think what's going to happen now is that the credits are going to roll more or less immediately.
Okay.
But